And it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Hyutra. Dr. Hyutra is a professor, distinguished professor, just updated right now, which is fantastic, at Boston University, and is currently an environmental ecologist investigating the impacts of urbanization on environmental carbon cycle dynamics. She received the 2023 MacArthur Genius Grant for her work to mitigate extreme heat and other consequences of climate change in urban environments. She has also received the National Science Foundation's Career Award and was a 2016 National Academy Science Cavil Fellow. In addition to all of this, Dr. Hyutra is an associate at the Arnold Arboretum and an associate in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. Beyond scholarly research, she has also focused on training students how to apply basic research to advance the livability of our communities. Dr. Hyutra also serves as the director for the BU Geosciences program and the associate director for the BU Urban Interdisciplinary Doctor program, and she is the co-leader for the BU Campus Climate Change Lab, bringing sustainability research into practice across the university. So we're so grateful that she is here to speak to all of us. We're also really excited to hear about her research and all the work that she is doing to help protect Mother Earth. Yes, we're all in this climate change chaos together, but we must have people leading the way and to find the answers and providing hope and solutions. So we saw some of that this morning, and Dr. Hyutra is also leading the way, and we're excited to hear what she has to say. So please join me in welcoming her to the stage, Dr. Hyutra.
So thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor, privilege, and I think the first time that I've gotten to speak to a high school community like this. So it's really exciting. And I am sincerely looking forward to the Q&A session to see what you all think of the story I'm going to tell you. So in my talk today, I'm going to think about the impacts of urbanization, the development, growth, and transformations that happen in our cities, and what the interface there is with climate change and carbon dioxide, and what we can do in terms of some solutions. So I'm sort of going to tell two stories today, but I want to start at the highest level first. And our climate is warming. So we all know this, but this graph is one that comes from NOAA. It shows since 1850 the anomaly, which means the difference from the mean in the temperature. So in the early part of the record, you can see it was variable year to year, but it was much cooler than it is now. And in the recent part of the record, it's increasing exponentially. 2023 was the warmest year on record, period. It was the warmest summer on record. It was the warmest year on record. 2024 is setting up to be just as hot. So we have a problem. And the reason the temperatures are warming is primarily due to the emissions of the combustion of fossil fuels, the emission of CO2 to the atmosphere. And this is a graph that shows over time how much CO2 we've been emitting to the atmosphere. So there are other mechanisms that are causing warming, but the dominant mechanism is carbon dioxide. So over time, this is going in the wrong direction, where it's continuing to increase. The rate of increase has slowed down. The United States this is a global figure. The United States is actually turned, where we are no longer increasing year over year. We're just not decreasing at the rate we need to be. And you could see there, come back. You can see that there's a couple of excursions in this. This was the global financial crisis of 2008. This is COVID. The world shutting down caused a one-year small dip in the rate of global emissions. And I'm hard-pressed to think of something like everybody's world got turned upside down. We stopped driving, businesses closed. It was a tiny dip. which is important to put the scale of the problem into context. There's big changes that have to happen to be able to tackle this. So this is globally. Now, these emissions, thankfully, are not all staying in the atmosphere. So the emission sources of that carbon dioxide are predominantly combustion of fossil fuels, and then deforestation and land use change across the globe, particularly in the tropics. So about 12% is due to land use change, 88% due to fossil fuel combustion. But not all of those emissions stay in the atmosphere. So about half of the CO2 that is getting released into the atmosphere stays in the atmosphere, which is a really good thing because the warming that we're seeing right now is only due to half of what we're emitting. Thankfully, and hopefully it lasts, the other half is getting sequestered. So 31% of our emissions that we put in the air get taken up by forests. So trees growing, creating wood, carbohydrates, that is holding carbon dioxide. So it started in the air, the trees took it. The ocean is taking up about 26%. And the ocean's uptake is a little less benign than plants growing because this uptake is associated with ocean acidification. Because in the process of oceans taking up carbon dioxide, it is changing the pH of the water and impacting coral reefs. But this part, which is what I'll focus on, is key to regulating our climate and is a miracle that will hopefully continue. And that miracle is part of what I'll talk about. So of the half of our emissions that are staying in the atmosphere, this is what atmospheric CO2 concentrations look like. This is a really steady rise. You see, this is a zoom in on the last couple of years. You see a seasonal oscillation in the amount of carbon dioxide measured in the air over Mauna Loa, Hawaii, which is one of the key global reference locations for measuring. This is the summer in the northern hemisphere. This is when plants in the northern hemisphere have their leaves out and are doing photosynthesis, taking up that carbon dioxide. These peaks are in the fall, when the leaves have fallen and they start decomposing. So this seesaw, seasonal oscillation, is the forests, the grasslands, the terrestrial ecosystems of the world doing their thing. I will note that just like 2023 was the hottest year on record, the annual increase in atmospheric CO2 in 2023 was the largest recorded. Ooh, this figure does not show up very well. This is a map of the United States. You'll have to trust me on that. This is a map of the United States. This is the DC-Baltimore corridor, sort of tilted on its side here. And if you could see this map, what you would see is hotspots, those bright yellow, orange, red spots, which is where the CO2 is actually being emitted. So about 70% of that combusted CO2 is emitted on 3% of the global land. This map, which is an emissions estimate map that we produced, shows where the emissions are happening. It doesn't show who's responsible for them necessarily, but you can see the roads, you can see the cities, right? I mean, New York City here is a beacon of light. That's where the people are concentrated. Nearly 80% of people live on 3% of the land. Oh, hey, we found the United States. So cities are key in this. They're key in this because it's where most of the people live, it's where most of the emissions happen. So the last graph that I showed you was from Mauna Loa, Hawaii, showing CO2. This is my building on Comm Ave. So these highest points that you see here, that's the roof of the College of Arts and Sciences building at Boston University. These lower ones are the Harvard Forest and a rural site in New Hampshire. And what you can see, this is the same sort of time series. You see a year-over-year increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide. But what you can see is that in Copley Square and at Boston University, the concentration is several parts per million higher than forests an hour and a half away, 100 kilometers away. So that 70% of emissions happening in cities, you can see it right here. The CO2 is being emitted in the city, and you see more CO2 in the air in the city than you do outside the city. So this is that combustion signal showing up here. Now, cities, beyond being population centers and combustion hotspots, which is what I've described them as so far, are also centers for innovation. The amount of policy experimentation, the amount of innovation that happens in cities drives the global economy, drives, advances in humanity. Cities are also putting forth pledges for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Almost every major US city that I can think of has a climate action plan where they've made an emissions pledge. I think it's hard to keep track, I mix them up. It's something on the order of 100% reduction in emissions by 2050 or something like that. A really ambitious goal. And in many cases, mayors are setting these goals for many years into the future. They will be out of office. But the goal is there, and policy tools are starting to be put in place. Requirements like in the case of Boston, BERDO, where building energy use is needing to be reported, and they're starting to put fines on buildings that don't reduce at a high enough rate. So cities are also putting these emissions goals in place, emissions reductions goals. And we can see the CO2 emitted in cities. And so for the last 15 years, my colleagues and I have been working on building a system to see if the policies are working. If the emissions reductions policies are working, we should be able to see it in the urban air. And so we published a paper a couple of years ago where we demonstrated for the first time a capacity to do that. So this, in the top lines, in the blue and the black, are the observations from the roof of Boston University and Copley, 2 sites that we had, 2 different heights in the atmosphere, and our model. And I, especially in this color, can't tell which is which, but they look the same. Our model was able to reproduce the observations, to be able to see, we could observe and model the sources for how the CO2 changed. This lower line is the air that was flowing into Boston before it got to Boston. So this is the clean air background, and then this is the enhanced CO2 that we see in the city. And this makes sense from the story that I've told you so far. And then things broke down. And let me tell you about what I spent the last decade of my life trying to figure out. What happened there? Because the entire story I just crafted for you says that urban CO2 should be higher than rural CO2 because of where the combustion's happening. And somehow, in the summer months, things changed to the point where we could no longer see in the atmosphere the difference between clean rural air and more polluted urban air. This is the summer. This is when forests and grasslands are active. They're photosynthesizing, but that explains why the curves go down, but it doesn't explain why the separation disappears, because photosynthesis is happening in both of these places. Cities are also dominated by the built environment. The countryside, the rural areas, places like the Harvard forest in Petersham, Massachusetts, are dominated by forests as far as the eye can see. So that photosynthesis signal should, by all accounts, be much larger outside the city than it is inside the city. And this has haunted me. And I think I have an answer, and I'll walk you through some of the answer. And this is one of the few good news climate stories I've ever told. So you're going to leave feeling good. So let's think for a minute about what vegetation looks like. So this is the Harvard forest in central Massachusetts, Petersham, Massachusetts. This is literally a textbook forest. Like the textbooks that you use in your high school biology, ecology class, the data came literally from here. It is like the most studied forest in the world. It's one of the National Science Foundation long-term ecological research sites. It is the source for the data and insights in your textbooks. It is trees as far as the eye can see, with some hills. This right here is a 3D wind sonic anemometer, and this site is the longest running site in the world where they are directly measuring forest uptake and release dynamics of carbon dioxide. I, as actually a college student, I won't tell you how many years ago, started my career hanging out on a tower working on exactly that instrument. So it's fun to still be working there. So our understanding comes from this. And we're applying this understanding to this. And it's not the same. So this is Boston, right? You can see the tall buildings, you can see the dominance of the roads and the infrastructure. You can also see a giant green space in the middle in the form of Boston Common. So it is not, as most global climate models assume, only a source of fossil fuel emissions. There's vegetation in cities. And it's actually kind of a sad statement that I've built my career convincing people that there's vegetation in cities and it matters. But there really is. And it's different because it's not just this kind of vegetation, it's also this kind of vegetation, which is what you have here in Braintree, right? You're gonna have suburban developments with green spaces and green patches that are running between. You're gonna have green grass. The green grass is often adjacent to the green trees. The green grass is watered and fertilized. The trees are indirectly watered and fertilized. So we also have this sort of vegetation in our developed landscape. This is back in Boston Common. These are open-grown trees. These are trees that can spread their arms out. Trees normally grow tall because they're competing with their neighbors for light. These trees don't have to grow as tall. They could grow wide, and they have all the light they could want. We also have things like, this is my garden in Arlington. My kale and my tomatoes have all the compost they could want. So there's huge additions of organic amendments into the vegetation space that you have in cities. So the nutrient limitations on productivity change. And then there's another big perturbation that happens, which is every fall and spring, we clean up our green spaces in cities, and we collect that organic material, we put it to the curb, and it goes away. It doesn't actually go away, but it's physically moved away from the location where those nutrients were extracted from the soil and that CO2 was being taken up. So if you think back to your biology class, there's two pieces in the carbon cycle related to vegetation. There's photosynthesis, the uptake process of taking CO2 from the air and fixing it into sugars. And then there's respiration, that decomposition process where the CO2 is released back into the air. In the city, we've modified the photosynthesis process because the growth form of trees is different, their nutrient availability is different, and we've eliminated much of the whole second half of the release of CO2. So these are not the same. They're not even close to equivalent, actually. And so for the last 10 years, I've worked on not telling just a narrative story with pictures, but rather trying to quantify these differences to try to build new biological models for what vegetation in the city does. So let's start by, I'll do one more cartoon and then we'll bring in data. So if we have an intact forest compared to a forest like the ones that I showed you that are in our cities, they tend to be either have edges or be open-grown trees. And if you're not in an intact, continuous forest like that first picture, your exposure to wind is going to be really different. You're much more likely to fall down. It gets hot and dry if you don't have neighbors that are providing shade to you. So if you're an open-grown tree or a tree in one of these fragments that you have, it gets very hot and dry, potentially too hot and dry, to the point where you can have fire. And the entry point for fire is somewhere usually at the edge, unless it's a lightning strike. And so the probability of you being hotter and drier and more flammable and having an ignition source increases. So in New England, less of an issue. In California, in the Amazon, this is a really big issue of if the growth form of the vegetation changes, the potential for disaster changes. So these factors are really negatives. So the way that we've structured our landscape in having these little patches of vegetation is potentially quite detrimental. And in the Amazon, the biggest study that's ever been done on what changing the structure of forests will do found they collapse and die. It was actually a really remarkably influential study about the consequences of deforestation and how, if we are going to be harvesting and deforesting, how should we do it and what will it mean? And all of the outcomes in terms of biodiversity, in terms of flammability, in terms of carbon were very, very negative. But nobody's really looked at what that would do in non-tropical systems, because there's also an upside to not having neighbors. In particular, light. Anyone who's ever grown any plant knows that plants love light. They grow to the light. And if you don't have a neighbor, you get more light. And you get more nutrients, because the wind blowing may cause you to fall down, but the wind blowing is also bringing nutrients through the atmosphere to the vegetation. In particular, car tailpipes, which emit that carbon dioxide that I've been talking about, they also emit nitrogen oxides, and some of those nitrogen oxides can actually fertilize the plants. You often also find these sorts of edges and lone trees near agricultural areas, and those agricultural areas apply fertilizer. So these factors will stimulate growth. So in order to try to put these pieces together on why would the vegetation be working differently in cities and in these fragmented landscapes that we have, we took advantage of the USDA has a large national inventory that they do, where they keep track of the country's timber, the country's forests. And so each point that I've shown here on these Northeast US maps, these are a 20-state area, is where the US Forest Service has sent a crew of people to hug trees and take soil samples repeatedly. And I had the most amazing PhD student who just graduated, who there's about 700 tables associated with this data set, and he was clever enough to triangulate locational information on where these plots are and be able to figure out which of these plots that the U.S. Forest Service has been measuring are in that expansive intact rural forest versus at an edge or in this small patches, which is what we have across much of our actual landscape. And so what we did was a really clever experiment where we created a control treatment effect statistically. We took these plots where we had 48,000 total plots that were directly measured by people, and the 6,600 of them were these edgy, not intact forest plots, and we created a matched control treatment experiment where we controlled for the amount of nitrogen that was getting deposited from the atmosphere. Nitrogen is the building block of Rubisco. You need that for photosynthesis. And so there's different rates of deposition across the US. We match them so that the amount of nutrients that they had coming in were the same. We match them so that the temperature and the temperature limitation was the same. So we weren't comparing really hot places to cooler places, different climates. We matched them on how much sunlight you had coming in. And then we matched them on what species and water limitation. And then we matched them on what species. So we were comparing maple to maple, where the light, moisture, and temperature limitations were the same. And what we found was really shocking. And then we ran it through a generalized linear model. What we found was really shocking. So this is a cross-section of a tree, right? So this is called a cookie. Looks like a cookie. So this is the cross-sectional area of a tree, and foresters refer to this as a basal area. So the total amount of ground that's covered by wood. And what we found is that if you look across species groups, there's differences in how much tree there is per ground area.